June 4th, 1942. Late morning. Somewhere over the Aleutian Islands, off the southern coast of Alaska, a Mitsubishi A6M20 is losing oil. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, 19 years old, watches the pressure gauge needle sink towards zero. Behind the firewall, a single bullet has severed the oil return line. The Nakajima Sakai engine is eating itself alive, metal grinding on metal, temperature climbing, power fading. Koga has minutes, not hours. Below him, the North Pacific stretches grey and endless in every direction. Ahead, 25 miles east of Dutch Harbour, sits Akutan Island, a treeless rock in the Aleutian chain designated by the Japanese Navy as an emergency landing field. A submarine is supposed to be waiting offshore to pick up downed pilots. Koga pushes the nose down and heads for the island. His two wingmen fly beside him, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo on the left, Petty Officer Tsugo Shikada on the right. They have throttled back to match Koga's dying airspeed, trailing oil smoke like a funeral procession across the grey Aleutian sky. All three pilots know the stakes. Every Japanese aviator carries the same standing order. If you crash land in enemy territory, destroy your aircraft. The Zero is Japan's most closely guarded military secret. No intact example has ever fallen into Allied hands. Not at Pearl Harbor, not over the Philippines, not in China. If the Americans get a flyable Zero, they will learn everything: the strengths, the weaknesses, the limits. The engine of Koga's airplane is seizing. The oil is gone. He has one chance to put it down. The three Zeros circle Akutan Island low, scanning the terrain. Half a mile inland from Broad Bight, Koga sees what looks like a landing strip, a long, flat valley floor covered in green grass. It looks perfect, level and firm, like a farmer's field. He lowers his landing gear, drops his flaps, and lines up for a three-point touchdown. Behind him, Shikada sees something Koga cannot. On his second pass over the valley, sunlight catches a glint of moisture beneath the grass. Shikada realizes the valley floor is not a field. It is a bog, knee-deep water hidden under knee-high grass. He wants to shout a warning, but Koga is already committed. Wheels down, flaps down, nose up, seconds from the surface. One decision, made in the final moments. If he had kept the gear retracted and belly landed, the fuselage would have skidded across the wet surface, and he would almost certainly have survived. The main gear hits the bog and sinks instantly into the mud. The Zero's forward momentum throws the tail over the nose. The airplane flips end over end, hurling water, mud, and clumps of grass into the air, and comes to rest upside down in the swamp. Inside the crushed cockpit, Tadayoshi Koga hangs from his safety harness, his head submerged in a foot of cold Aleutian water. His neck is broken. He is dead. 19 years old. His Zero, serial number 4593, rolled off the Mitsubishi assembly line just 3.5 months earlier, on February 19th, 1942. It has red tail markings and a yellow fuselage band. And apart from a bent vertical stabilizer and crumpled wingtips, it is almost completely intact. The most guarded secret in the Japanese military is lying upside down in an Alaskan swamp. But we are getting ahead of the story. Before we can understand why a dead teenager in an Aleutian bog changed the course of the Pacific War, we need to understand the machine he was flying. Because in June of 1942, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was not just a fighter plane, it was a legend, arguably the most feared combat aircraft on the planet. From Pearl Harbor to Burma, from the Dutch East Indies to the Coral Sea, it had dominated every sky it entered. And no one in the United States fully understood why it was so good, or how to beat it. That ignorance was killing American pilots by the hundreds, and the war was less than 6 months old. The Zero entered combat over China in the summer of 1940. Mitsubishi's chief designer, Jiro Horikoshi, had created something revolutionary: a long-range carrier fighter that sacrificed every ounce of weight for speed and agility. No armor behind the pilot's seat, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no bulletproof windshield. Just a Nakajima Sakai radial engine, 940 horsepower. driving a lightweight airframe armed with two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns. The result was a fighter with a range of over 1,900 miles, more than any carrier aircraft in the world, and a turning radius so tight it could fly circles around anything the Allies put in the sky. The specifications told only part of the story. The A6 M2 Model 21 weighed just over 5,300 pounds fully loaded, nearly 2 tons lighter than the American F4F Wildcat. It had a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 33,000 feet, and the ability to climb to altitude faster than any Allied fighter in the Pacific. Horikoshi had achieved this by building the airframe from a lightweight aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin and by systematically eliminating every component that added weight without adding performance. The philosophy was elegant and brutal. The best defense is not to get hit. If the pilot was good enough, he did not need armor. In its first engagements over China, the Zero shot down every opponent it met. 13 Chinese fighters destroyed in a single day. 0 losses. The American military attaché in China, Colonel Claire Chenot, commander of the Volunteer Flying Tigers, sent a detailed report to Washington warning that Japan had built a fighter unlike anything the West had seen. Fast, agile, deadly at close range, and capable of flying enormous distances without refueling. His letter was filed in a cabinet at the War Department and forgotten. When the Zero appeared over Pearl Harbor 6 months later, the shock was total. On December 7, 1941, Zeros escorted the bombers that devastated the Pacific Fleet. Over the following months, they dominated every theater they entered: the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, Malaya, the Indian Ocean. The Zero outflew the F-2A Buffalo, the P-40 Warhawk, the P-39 Airacobra, and the F-4F Wildcat. In April 1942, 36 Zeros attacked 60 British aircraft over Ceylon, some of them flown by experienced veterans of the Battle of Britain. The Zeros shot down 27. They lost 1. The kill ratio was so lopsided that American commanders issued a simple tactical instruction for any pilot who encountered a Zero in combat. The official strategy was one word: run. American pilots began to speak of the Zero in almost supernatural terms. It was faster, it climbed better, it turned tighter, it appeared out of nowhere and vanished into clouds. And nobody knew how it did any of it. 9 wrecks had been recovered from Pearl Harbor, and the wreckage revealed that the Zero had no armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. That was useful intelligence. But it told the Americans nothing about how the airplane actually flew: the speeds where it excelled, the maneuvers where it struggled, the conditions where it broke down. To learn that, you needed to sit in the cockpit. You needed to fly it. Without that knowledge, the Zero was a ghost, fast, lethal, and seemingly invincible. The Allies had tried to capture one before. In February 1942, a Zero piloted by Hajime Toyoshima crashed on Melville Island in northern Australia after the bombing of Darwin. The airframe was too badly damaged to fly. Another Zero crash-landed near Cape Rodney in New Guinea, but the recovery team made a catastrophic error. They chopped off the wings to transport it, severing the main wing spars and destroying any chance of rebuilding it. A third Zero was pieced together in China from salvaged wreckage by an American engineer named Gerhard Neumann. But it would not reach the United States until after the Akutan Zero was already flying. By mid-1942, the Americans had fragments, wrecks, and photographs. What they did not have was an intact flyable Zero, and without one, they were fighting blind. That was the state of affairs on June 3, 1942, when a Japanese task force led by Admiral Kakuji Kakuta launched airstrikes against Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. The attack has been debated by historians for 80 years. Some call it a diversion designed to draw the American fleet north while Admiral Yamamoto's main force attacked Midway Island, 1,500 miles to the south. Others say it was an independent operation intended to seize the Aleutians and secure Japan's northern flank. Whatever the strategic rationale, the Japanese sent 2 aircraft carriers, the light carrier Ryujo and the escort carrier Junyo, plus cruisers, destroyers, and support ships to bomb an American outpost in one of the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth. The first strike hit Dutch Harbor on June 3rd. Bombers and fighters swept in through the fog and dropped ordnance on barracks, oil storage tanks, and the radio station. The damage was significant, but not crippling. The next morning, June 4th, the carriers launched a second wave. Among the pilots climbing into their cockpits on the deck of the Ryujo was Tadayoshi Koga, 19 years old, the son of a carpenter from rural Japan. He had entered naval aviation training as a teenager and earned his wings at an age when most American boys were starting college. He flew with his two wingmen, Endo and Shikada, in a three-plane section assigned to strafe the harbor. Their attack run was fast and violent. The three Zeros swept over Dutch harbor at low altitude, guns blazing. During the strafing, the section is believed to have intercepted an American PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Bud Mitchell. They shot it down and strafed the crew in the water, killing several. In the chaos of the attack, Koga Zero took a hit. The accounts disagree on the source: ground fire from the base defenses or return fire from the Catalina before it went down. What every account agrees on is the result. A single round, probably .50 caliber, struck the oil return line behind the engine. Within minutes, Koga was trailing a long ribbon of white smoke, his oil pressure dropping, his engine temperature climbing. He was 25 miles from Akutan Island. He turned east. And what happened next? The approach, the landing gear, the bog, the flip, the broken neck, we have already seen. But the story of the Akutan Zero did not end with Tadayoshi Koga's death. In fact, his death was only the beginning. Because the most important intelligence prize of the Pacific War was now sitting in a swamp on a remote Alaskan island, and a chain of coincidences was about to deliver it into American hands. Every link in that chain depended on luck, error, and one wingman's inability to kill a friend. Endo and Shikada circled above the overturned Zero at low altitude. There was no movement in the cockpit, no hand signal, no flare. They did not know whether Koga was alive or dead, only that he was not climbing out. Their orders were explicit. Every Japanese pilot understood: destroy any Zero that lands in enemy territory. Shikada's twin 7.7mm machine guns could have set the fuel tanks alight in seconds. But Koga was not an abstraction. He was a friend. What if he was unconscious, but alive? What if he woke up, destroyed the aircraft himself, and walked to the submarine? Shikada made one more low pass over the wreck, then turned west with Endo and flew back to the carrier. 42 years later, Shikada published an account of that day and wrote that the decision not to fire haunted him for the rest of his life. The Japanese submarines stationed off Akutan searched the shoreline for Koga, but found nothing. The destroyer, USS Williamson, detected the submarine and drove it off before it could locate the crash site. And then there was nothing. The Zero sat upside down in the bog, invisible beneath the constant Aleutian fog, hidden from the sea by a half-mile of marshy terrain off every standard patrol route. Pilots in the Aleutians flew over water, not land. The fog and turbulence over the islands were dangerous and unnecessary. There was no reason for any Allied aircraft to cross Akutan Island. The most important piece of Japanese technology in existence was lying in a swamp, undiscovered, with a dead teenager hanging upside down inside it. 36 days. That is how long Koga Zero sat in the bog, unseen, untouched, slowly sinking into the mud. Then, on July 10th, 1942, a Navy PBY Catalina, piloted by Lieutenant William Thies, was returning from an overnight patrol. Thies had been navigating by dead reckoning, compass headings and estimated wind corrections, no radar, no radio beacons, and he had gotten lost. When he spotted the Shumagin Islands through a break in the clouds, he reoriented and calculated the most direct route back to Dutch Harbor. That route took him straight over Akutan Island. Most pilots avoided overland crossings. Thies only flew this path because he was lost. If his navigation had been correct, He would have flown a standard route over open water and never seen the wreck. As the Catalina crossed the island at low altitude, machinist mate Albert Knack, the plane captain responsible for maintaining the aircraft, looked down through a side blister and saw a shape in the grass. He called over the intercom. "There is an airplane on the ground down there, and it has meatballs on the wings." Meatballs meant the rising sun. These banked the Catalina, descended, and circled the crash site for several minutes. He could see the red roundels. He could see the inverted fuselage, remarkably intact. He marked the position on his chart and flew back to Dutch Harbor at full speed. That evening, Thies persuaded his commanding officer, Paul Foley, to let him return with a team. Nobody knew yet that the airplane in the swamp was a Zero. Nobody understood what they had found. The next day, July 11th, Thies and his crew flew back and waded through a foot of swamp water to reach the wreck. What they found was extraordinary. The Zero was nearly intact, bent and muddy but structurally sound. Koga's body was still inside, hanging upside down from his harness, his head resting in the water. He had been tightly taped from his waist to his shoulders, either from a previous back injury or as a precaution against high-speed maneuvers. Navy photographer Arthur Baumann documented the scene. Then Albert Knack, the smallest man on the crew, crawled up inside the inverted fuselage and cut Koga's safety harness with a knife. They carried his body to a nearby knoll and buried him in a shallow grave, marking the site. Then they turned their attention to the airplane. The first recovery attempt failed. They had no heavy equipment. The delivery ship had lost 2 anchors and could not unload its crane. The bog held the Zero like a fist. A second attempt also failed. On July 15th, a third team arrived with proper machinery. They freed the airplane from the mud, hauled it overland to a barge at Broad Bight, and transported it to Dutch Harbor. There it was cleaned, turned right side up, and loaded onto the USS Saint Mihiel. The ship sailed for Seattle, arriving on August 1st. From Seattle, the Zero was barged south to Naval Air Station North Island near San Diego, where it was placed under 24-hour military police guard. Word had spread. Souvenir hunters were already circling. The repairs began immediately. Navy mechanics straightened the vertical stabilizer, the rudder, the wingtips, the flaps, and the canopy. The landing struts, the ones that had caught in the bog and killed Koga, required more extensive reconstruction. The 3-blade Sumitomo propeller was dressed and reused. The seized Nakajima Sakai 12 engine was rebuilt, its damaged components replaced. When the work was finished, 6 weeks later, the airframe was 98% original Japanese. The rising sun roundels were painted over with the standard American insignia, blue circle, white star. And on September 20th, 1942, 3.5 months after Tadayoshi Koga's death on Akutan Island, the Zero was ready to fly in American colors. The engineers who worked on it were astonished. The fit and finish of the Zero was extraordinary. Rivets flush with the skin, fairings precisely curved, access panels sealed tight. The craftsmanship rivaled anything produced by American factories. But when they looked deeper, they understood the price. No armor plate anywhere. The fuel tanks were simple aluminum containers. A single incendiary round would turn them into fireballs. The control cables were lightweight but fragile. Every design choice pointed to the same philosophy. Horikoshi had built the fastest, most agile fighter in the world by accepting that its pilot was expendable. The American mechanics, used to building machines that brought their pilots home, found the trade-off chilling. The Zero was kept under 24-hour military police guard. Word had spread across the base that something extraordinary was inside that hangar. The man who climbed into the cockpit was Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, a Navy test pilot, experienced, methodical, careful. Sanders had spent a week studying the airplane while the final repairs were completed, examining every control surface, every gauge, every mechanism. On the morning of September 20th, he started the rebuilt Sakai engine, taxied to the runway at North Island, and took off. He would fly Koga's Zero 24 times in 25 days, from September 20th to October 15th. Decades later, in interviews, Sanders recalled the experience with a precision that suggested the flights had never left his memory. What he found in those 24 flights changed the air war. If you want to know what weaknesses Sanders discovered, the secrets that flipped the entire balance of the Pacific Air War, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened next stunned every American pilot who heard it, and it stunned the Japanese high command even more. 46 years later, Sanders could still describe every detail of those flights as if they had happened that morning. What one man found in the cockpit of a dead teenager's airplane rewrote the rules of aerial combat in the Pacific, back to North Island. September 20th, 1942. Eddie Sanders, the very first flight. Sanders reported that at low speed, the Zero was extraordinary. Smooth, responsive, featherlight on the controls, short turning radius, superb aileron authority below 150 knots. He understood instantly why it dominated every dogfight in the Pacific. At the speeds where aerial combat traditionally happened, low and slow, turning and twisting, the Zero was untouchable. No American fighter could stay with it in a turning fight. But then Sanders began to push the airspeed higher, past 170 knots, past 190, and at 200 knots, something remarkable happened. The airplane changed. The ailerons froze. Above 200 knots, the control surfaces became sluggish, heavy, and almost immovable. Rolling maneuvers that were effortless at low speed became painfully slow and physically exhausting at high speed. Sanders discovered that the Zero rolled to the left far more easily than to the right. At 250 knots, a hard right roll was nearly impossible. The stick required enormous force, and the airplane barely responded. For American pilots trained to roll into evasive maneuvers at high speed, this was a revelation. The invincible Zero had a blind spot, and it was on the right side. But there was something even more devastating. The engine cut out under negative acceleration. When Sanders pushed the nose forward into a steep dive, the kind of maneuver that induces negative G-forces where the pilot feels momentarily weightless, the float-type carburetor in the Nakajima Sakai starved the engine of fuel. The engine simply stopped. For several critical seconds, the Zero became a powerless glider in a dive. Every American fighter in the Pacific, the P-38, the F-4U Corsair, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the F-6F, used fuel injection systems that functioned perfectly under negative G. American planes could push over into a dive and keep their engines roaring. The Zero could not. Sanders compiled his findings into a report. The recommended tactic was devastatingly simple. If a Zero gets on your tail, do not try to outturn it at low speed. You will lose. Instead, push the stick forward into a vertical power dive, using negative G to open the range while the Zero's engine is dead. Accelerate past 200 knots, then roll hard to the right, the direction the Zero handles worst. The Zero pilot will be fighting a dead engine and frozen ailerons simultaneously while you pull away with full power. Sanders radioed the recommended tactic to the Pacific Fleet after his very first test flight. The response came back within days. 2 words that changed the war. It works. The intelligence spread across the Pacific like wildfire. By late September 1942, Allied pilots from Guadalcanal to New Guinea knew how to escape a pursuing Zero. But Sanders was not finished. Over the following weeks, the Akutan Zero was flown in mock dogfights against every frontline American fighter. The F-4F Wildcat, the P-38 Lightning, the P-39 Airacobra. Pilot after pilot climbed into Koga's cockpit and dueled with their own countrymen flying American machines. Every session produced more data. The precise speed envelope where each weakness appeared. The G-loading that killed the engine. The exact angle of attack where the Zero's legendary agility simply evaporated. All of it was documented, published in classified intelligence summaries, and distributed to combat squadrons. The results were measurable almost immediately. In the skies over Guadalcanal in late 1942 and early 1943, American fighter pilots who had been briefed on the Sanders data began surviving engagements they would have lost weeks earlier. They stopped trying to dogfight. They stopped turning. They dove, they rolled right, and they lived. The kill ratios started shifting. Not dramatically, the Zero was still a lethal machine in the hands of an experienced pilot, but enough to matter, enough to bring men home. The data from 24 test flights in San Diego was reaching cockpits 10,000 miles away, and pilots who would have died were landing safely. That is what one captured airplane did, not in theory, in practice. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most people do not expect, because there is a myth about the Akutan Zero. A myth repeated in books, documentaries, and magazine articles for 8 decades. The story goes like this. The Americans captured the Zero, studied its secrets, and used what they learned to design the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the fighter that ultimately destroyed Japanese air power and won the Pacific War. It is a clean, satisfying narrative. One captured airplane leads to one revolutionary design, leads to total victory. The problem is that it is completely wrong. The Grumman X F6F1 Hellcat prototype made its first flight on June 26, 1942. That was 14 days before Bill Thies even spotted the wreck on Akutan Island. Large production contracts for the Hellcat had been signed in May of 1942, a full month before Koga's crash. The Hellcat was designed from the combat lessons of Midway and the Coral Sea, from the hard-won experience of Wildcat pilots, and from the engineering brilliance of the Grumman design team led by Leroy Grumman himself. They built a fighter that was bigger, heavier, better armored, and vastly more powerful than anything Japan could produce. The Hellcat was a masterpiece of American engineering on its own terms. It did not need the Akutan Zero. So what did the Akutan Zero actually change? Not the hardware, the tactics. And in the calculus of aerial warfare, tactics are what keep pilots alive. The Hellcat did not reach frontline combat units until August of 1943, 11 full months after Sanders's test flights. During those 11 months, American pilots were still flying the F-4F Wildcat, the P-38, and the P-40 against the Zero in the skies over Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. Men were dying every week because they instinctively turned left instead of right, or tried to outturn the Zero instead of diving away. The tactics that Sanders radioed from his very first flight saved lives immediately. Not in 1943, when the Hellcat arrived, but in the fall of 1942, when the killing was at its worst. Marine Captain Kenneth Walsh flew the F-4U Corsair in the Solomon Islands. He finished the war with 21 confirmed aerial victories, 17 of them against Zeros. Walsh survived because of what Sanders learned from Koga's airplane. His words, "With a Zero on my tail, I did a split S, and with its nose down and full throttle, my Corsair picked up speed fast. I wanted at least 240 knots, preferably 260. Then, as prescribed, I rolled hard right. Traces from the Zero zinged past my belly. From information that came from Koga's Zero, I knew it rolled more slowly to the right. If I had rolled to my left, the Zero would have turned with me, locked on, and had me." Walsh said that the information from the Akutan Zero saved his life on multiple occasions. Fighter ace William Leonard, who flew the captured Zero himself during the testing program, called it the single most important intelligence acquisition of the entire war. In his words, "No other captured machine has ever unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great." And Japanese military historian Masatake Okumiya, a lieutenant general in the post-war Japan Air Self-Defense Force, wrote that the capture of the Akutan Zero was as catastrophic for Japan as the naval defeat at the Battle of Midway. Coming from a Japanese officer, that comparison is staggering. Not because of a new airplane, not because of a new weapon, because of knowledge. Because one test pilot in San Diego had decoded the machine that was winning the war. Then the Hellcat arrived. And the Hellcat, flown by pilots who already knew every weakness of the enemy from the Akutan Zero tests, turned the Pacific Air War into a systematic destruction. The F-6F was everything the Zero was not. 212 pounds of cockpit armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, a bulletproof windshield, 2,000 horsepower from the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 650 caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds each. It was heavier and slower in a turning fight, but its pilots had been trained to never fight that way. Dive, roll right. Use your speed, your armor, your firepower, and the knowledge that came from a dead teenager's airplane. June 19th, 1944. 2 years after Koga's crash on Akutan. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy launched its entire remaining carrier air force, nearly 450 aircraft, against the American Fifth Fleet near the Mariana Islands. Hundreds of Hellcats scrambled to intercept. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days of slaughter, American pilots shot down nearly 480 Japanese aircraft. The Americans lost fewer than 24 Hellcats in air-to-air combat. Commander Charles Brewer of the USS Essex destroyed 4 enemy planes in the opening minutes. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu of the USS Lexington shot down 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes, using only 360 rounds of ammunition. A pilot aboard the Lexington was heard to say afterward, "This is like an old-time turkey shoot." The Japanese lost 3 aircraft carriers in the battle: the Taiho, the Shokaku, and the Hiyo, along with hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and the veteran pilots who flew them. Japan's naval aviation, which had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, ceased to exist as a fighting force in 2 days of combat. The Japanese training programs, already strained, could not replace the quality of aviators lost. The pilots they sent into battle were increasingly young, increasingly inexperienced, and increasingly doomed. What had once been the most feared aerial fighting force in the world had been dismantled by a combination of superior machines and superior knowledge. And a significant portion of that knowledge traced back to 24 test flights in San Diego, flown in the cockpit of a dead teenager's airplane. By the time Japan surrendered, the F-6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,163 Japanese aircraft, 75% of all aerial kills recorded by the United States Navy in the Pacific. 305 Hellcat pilots became aces. The overall kill ratio against the Zero was 13-1. The airplane that had terrorized the Pacific for 2 years, the ghost that could not be caught, the machine that made American pilots run, was finished. And the chain that led to its destruction started with a single bullet cutting an oil line over Dutch Harbor, Alaska. There is another layer to the tragedy. Japan knew the Zero's weaknesses long before the Americans discovered them. Japanese engineers and experienced combat pilots had reported the aileron stiffening at high speed, the carburetor issue, the lack of survivability. But the Japanese military command chose not to redesign the Zero. They chose not to add armor. They chose not to fix the carburetor. The philosophy that had made the Zero dominant, sacrifice everything for performance, became the philosophy that doomed it. By 1944, the same design choices that Horikoshi made in 1939 were getting Japanese pilots killed in numbers that no training program could replace. The Americans found the weaknesses from the outside. Japan knew them from the inside. Neither could save the men who flew it. Koga's Zero, the airplane that unlocked every secret, did not survive the war. In February of 1945, the Zero was taxiing at North Island for a routine training flight when a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver lost directional control on the adjacent taxiway and slammed directly into it. The Helldiver's spinning propeller sliced the Akutan Zero into pieces. The most important intelligence prize of the Pacific War was destroyed not by the Japanese, not by combat, but by an American training accident on a sunny day in San Diego. Lieutenant William Leonard salvaged several instruments from the wreckage. They now sit behind glass at the National Museum of the United States Navy. Other fragments ended up at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and the Alaska Heritage Museum in Anchorage. Small pieces of aluminum, gauges, fittings, scraps of fuselage skin, scattered across institutions like relics of a saint. There is no complete Akutan Zero anywhere. The airplane that changed the war exists only in photographs, in test reports, and in the memories of the men who flew it. Serial number 4593. Red tail marking DY108. Built February 19th, 1942. Destroyed February 1945. 3 years of service, most of them in American colors, fighting against the country that built it. And the boy from rural Japan, Tadayoshi Koga. Born September 10th, 1922. The son of a carpenter, he entered naval aviation training as a teenager and earned his wings at an age when most Americans his age were starting college. In the single undated service photograph that survives, he looks directly at the camera, almost smiling. Left hand tucked casually into the pocket of his uniform. Confident and young, he had no way of knowing that the machine beneath him would betray him. Not through any fault of design, but through the simple, terrible physics of landing gear, meeting waterlogged Earth on a treeless island at the edge of the world. Koga lay in his shallow grave on Akutan for 5 years. In 1947, an American Graves Registration Service team exhumed his remains during a routine cleanup of wartime burials across the Aleutians. They did not know who he was. They marked the body as unidentified and reburied it on Adak Island, further down the chain. In 1953, the Adak Military Cemetery was closed and 236 bodies were returned to Japan. Only 13 were identified. Koga's name was not among them, but it is all but certain that he was one of the 223 unidentified remains cremated and interred at the Chidoriga-Fuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo. If so, then Tadayoshi Koga went home. In 1988, American author Jim Reardon traveled to Akutan Island to find Koga's original grave. He located the site on the knoll where the Navy team had buried him 46 years earlier. The grave was empty. Reardon spent years tracking the chain, Akutan to Adak, Adak to Japan, and confirmed that Koga was almost certainly among those repatriated. Reardon also tracked down Tsuguo Shikada, the wingman who could not bring himself to fire on the overturned Zero. Shikada was an old man by then. He told Reardon that the decision haunted him every day of his life. Not because he had failed his duty, but because he wondered endlessly what would have happened if he had pulled the trigger. Think about the chain of events. A single bullet cuts an oil line. A 19-year-old sees a green field and puts his wheels down. The field is a bog. He dies. His friends cannot bring themselves to shoot. A submarine is driven off. The wreck sits undiscovered for 36 days in constant fog. A lost American pilot takes a wrong turn and flies directly over the one island where the wreck lies. A crewman happens to look down at the right moment and sees red circles on the wings. The airplane is pulled from the mud, shipped 3,000 miles, rebuilt in 6 weeks, and flown. One test pilot writes one report. The report is radioed to the fleet. Pilots who were dying start surviving. A new fighter arrives, with its pilots already knowing every weakness of the enemy. The result is the destruction of Japanese naval aviation. If any single link in that chain breaks, if the bullet misses, if Koga belly lands and survives, if Shikada follows orders and strafes the wreck, if These navigates correctly and never flies over Akutan, if Nak looks the other way, then the Zero is never found. The Pacific War does not change overnight. Thousands of American pilots continue to turn left instead of right, to dogfight instead of diving, to die in cockpits against a machine they do not understand. The Hellcat still arrives because it was already being built, but its pilots go to war without the playbook, without the knowledge that came from a dead teenager's airplane in an Alaskan swamp. One decision: wheels down instead of belly landing. Made in the last 5 seconds of Tadayoshi Koga's life. He was 19 years old. He never knew what his airplane would do after he died. He never knew that his death would lead to the deaths of thousands of his countrymen. He never knew that his broken Zero in an Aleutian bog would become what historians call one of the greatest prizes of the Pacific War. He never knew that the boy who cut him from his harness would be the smallest man on a crew that arrived by accident. He just saw a green field and tried to land, and the wheels went down. Every war has 1,000 turning points that never make the textbooks. Akutan Island is one of them, a patch of bog on a treeless rock at the edge of the world, where a boy from rural Japan lowered his wheels and changed the sky over the entire Pacific. The Mitsubishi Zero was never the same after that day. Not because someone built a better airplane, because someone found the truth about the one Japan had already built. A single bullet, a single decision, a single swamp. And the truth, once found, could never be unfound. In war, that is the most dangerous weapon of all.